US, or Yin Lee from New Jersey, after the US. He's going to present his seminar on replacement effects. If you think that you knew everything about replacement effects, you're certainly wrong, because I was looking at his presentation earlier and I was like, oh wow, that's complicated. So this is a very interesting seminar, going deep in really crazy aspect of the roles that sometimes is not as easy as it would seem. So I'll let you to Stephen. Thank you very much.
So as David said, my name is Stephen Zwanger. I'm a level 3 from Roanoke, Virginia. And I'll be talking to you about replacement effects. So the first question is, what is a replacement effect? Can anyone tell me? Anyone? A replacement effect is an effect that completely or partially replaces one event with a different event. Generally, replacement effects are continuous, not one-shot effects. They just watch continuously for their event to happen. There is one exception, which is that an effect of a resolving spell or ability can also be a replacement effect, and we call this a self-replacement effect. How do you recognize a replacement effect? There are certain key words to look for. For example, effects that use the word instead are replacement effects. This includes all regeneration effects. Effects that use the word skip are also replacement effects. Effects that modify how an object enters the battlefield. There are various ways to describe this. And finally, prevention effects, damage prevention effects, function identically to replacement effects. Let's look at some examples. An example of the word instead is obstinate bailoff. It says, if a spell or ability an opponent controls would make you discard it, instead you put it onto the battlefield. Here's an example of a regeneration effect, and you can see from the reminder text that it uses the word instead. And here's another example of regeneration. More commonly, it does not use the keyword instead in the reminder text, because it doesn't have any. So you just have to know that it is a replacement effect. An example of the word skip. Blinding Angel can cause a player to skip his combat phase. Now we're going to look at some cards that have replacement effects that modify how objects enter the battlefield. So one example is the phrasing, this permanent enters the battlefield with, for example, Carnifex Demon enters the battlefield with 2 -1/-1 counters. Another example is as this permanent enters the battlefield, such as Nevermore, it says, as it enters the battlefield, name a card. Similarly, this permanent enters the battlefield as, you see these a lot with copy effects, such as clone. Do you have a question?
Yes, about the previous one. What does this particular thing modify? Like, what
So
does it
normally when a permanent spell resolves, a permanent enters the battlefield. That's the event. In this case, we have a permanent entering the battlefield, and the replacement effect is modifying that event to it enters the battlefield and you name a card. Normally, when a permanent enters the battlefield, you don't name the card. The next one is this permanent enters the battlefield, such as Rotting Legion, which enters the battlefield tapped. And objects in general enter the battlefield, such as Urabrask, which causes creatures your opponents control to enter the battlefield tapped. And now, a quick example of prevention effects. Fog prevents all combat damage. Any questions so far?
Shock length is the shock length.
Shock lengths.
Is a sample of the enter the battlefield.
Yes. The shock lands from Return to Ravnica block also have a replacement effect that modifies how they enter the battlefield. As they enter the battlefield, you can either pay 2 life or have them enter the battlefield tapped. So let's look at some cards, and I'd like you to tell me if the following cards have replacement effects or not. So, Doubling Season. I'll give you a moment to look at the card. How many people say that Doubling Season has a replacement effect? Just raise your hand if you think it has a replacement effect. How many people say it does not have a replacement effect? Doubling season is pretty easy. It uses the word instead, so it has a replacement effect. How about Vesuva? How many people say that Vesuva has a replacement effect? And how many say it does not? Vesuva has a replacement effect that modifies how it enters the battlefield. How about Coarse Skyfisher? How many people say that Coarse Skyfisher has a replacement effect? And how many say it does not?
No.
Coarse Skyfisher has a trigger ability. It does not modify how it enters the battlefield. The ability triggers after it enters the battlefield and then does something. We go see the Water Veil. I'll give you a moment to read this card. It's a little obscure. How many people say that there's a replacement effect on Lugosi the Water Veil? How many people say there's not a replacement effect? There are actually two. The first one is it enters the battlefield tapped, and then it also has one that can cause a player to skip their turn. Grafdigger's Cage. How many people say the Grafdigger's Cage has a replacement effect? And how many say it does not?
No. No.
And how many people are not sure? Grafdigger's Cage does not have a replacement effect. It does not use any of the keywords. It does not use the word instead. It does not use the word skip. It does not modify how a permanent enters the battlefield, and it does not prevent damage. So there are no replacement effects here on Grafdigger's Cage.
Continuous effect?
It has a continuous effect that prevents certain things from happening, but that is not a replacement effect. That just changes how things happen. Rising Waters. An older card. I'll give you a moment to read it. How many people say that Rising Waters has a replacement effect? And how many people say it does not? Again, Rising Waters does not use any of the key words. Does not use the word instead, does not use the word skip, does not modify how permanents enter the battlefield, does not prevent damage. So there are no replacement effects on Rising Waters. Now let's look at an example of self-replacement effects. Self-replacement effects, unlike other replacement effects, are not continuous effects. They're part of a resolving spell or ability that replaces part of that spell or ability's effects. We call these self-replacement effects. Whenever you are applying multiple replacement effects to an event, we always apply self-replacement effects first. And we'll see later on why that matters. So now I'd like you to tell me if the following cards have self-replacement effects. Rock's Faithmender. Rock's Faithmender has a replacement effect that modifies what happens when a player would gain life. How many people say that this is a self-replacement effect? How many people say it is not? It is not. Now let's look at Searing Blaze. Searing Blaze also has a replacement effect. You can see the word instead in the text. How many people say that Searing Blaze has a self-replacement effect? And how many people say it does not? Searing Blaze does have a self-replacement effect. You can tell because this effect can only apply to the resolution of Searing Blaze. It can't apply to anything else. A good guideline is that if the effect can replace external events, it's not a self-replacement effect. Rock's Faithmender can apply to any time a player can gain life. Therefore, it's not a self-replacement effect. Searing Blaze, like I said, only applies to the resolution of Searing Blaze. Let's look at a couple more. Loxodon Smiter clearly has a replacement effect because it uses the word instead. How many people say that this is a self-replacement effect? And how many people say it is not? Good. Here's another guideline. The self-replacement effect is part of a resolving spell or ability and replaces part or all of that spell or ability's own effects. The replacement effect on Loxodon Smiter is not modifying a resolving spell or ability. It just does something whenever you would discard Loxodon Smiter. Therefore, it's not a self-replacement effect. Now, this is where it gets tricky. We're going to look at the interaction of multiple replacement effects and or damage prevention effects. So one thing you need to know is when there are multiple replacement effects that apply to an event, who chooses the order in which to apply them? Can anybody tell me? Close. The affected player or the controller of the affected object, or if the object has no controller, then the owner of the affected object. Also, there's an order in which we apply replacement effects. As I've said, we always apply self-replacement effects first. After we're done applying all self-replacement effects, we apply any replacement effects that change the control of an object. Then we apply any self-replacement effects that are copy effects, such as clone. Then we apply everything else. Now you'll note these are not layers. They don't work like layers. For example, when you're using layers, copy effects come first, then control. When you're applying replacement effects, control effects apply first, and then copy effects apply. And again, we'll see later why this matters. So whenever you're applying multiple replacement effects, continue applying effects starting from the top layer, the top type of replacement effect, until there are no more left to apply. Also, it's important to remember that applying one replacement effect may cause another to no longer apply, or may cause another replacement effect to newly apply. You have to take this into account whenever you're applying multiple replacement effects. So here's some examples. Alice controls Ghosts of the Innocent. Ghosts of the Innocent has a replacement effect that modifies damage. It basically cuts damage in half. And Alice also controls Furnace of Wrath. Furnace of Wrath has the opposite effect. It doubles damage. And Alice casts Lava Axe, targeting her opponent Ned. So, who is the affected player here, and what happens? First, tell me, who is the affected player here? How many people say it's Alice? And how many people say it's Ned? So the affected player is Ned because he's the one who's being dealt damage. He's the one being affected by Lava Axe. Therefore, he's the one who chooses in which order to apply the replacement effects. Now, can anybody tell me what happens as Lava Axe resolves? That's exactly correct. So there are two replacement effects here, both of which can modify the damage from Lava Axe. Ghost of the Innocent can cut it in half, Furnace of Wrath can double it. If Ned applies Ghost of the Innocent's effect first, Lava Axe's damage is cut in half to 2, and then Furnace of Wrath doubles it to 4. Or if he applies Furnace of Wrath first, Lava Axe is doubled to 10, and then Ghost of the Innocent halves it to 5. Let's look at another example. Alice controls Phytohydra. Again, Phytohydra has a replacement effect. This is the word instead. So that's how you can recognize it as a replacement effect. Ned activates Killsuit Cultist. Killsuit Cultist says, if a creature would be dealt damage, destroy it instead. And Ned casts one of my favorite spells, a very versatile spell called Inferno, which basically blows up the world. So what happens to Phytohydra, and who decides? So first, who decides? Who's the chooser of the order in which to apply these replacement effects? How many people say it's Alice? And how many people say it's Ned? The affected object is Phytohydra. Alice is the controller, so she chooses the order in which to apply it. Can anybody tell me the possible outcomes we have here? There are two replacement effects, both of which can be applied to the damage that Inferno deals. If she applies Phytohydra's effect first, she puts 6 counters on Phytohydra. Now, the event is no longer dealing damage, so there's nothing left for Killsuit Cultist's effect to apply to. On the other hand, if she applies Killsuit Cultist's effect first, and it changes the event to Phytohydra is destroyed. And again, there's no longer a damage-dealing event for Phytohydra's effect to replace. Here's another example. Ned controls Pulmonic Sliver. Again, has a replacement effect. He uses the word instead. Alice targets it with Annihilating Fire. Annihilating Fire also has a replacement effect because it uses the word instead. So what happens to Pulmonix liver, and who decides? So first, who decides? How many people say Alice decides? How many people say Ned decides? Again, Ned decides because he's the one controlling Pulmonix liver. Can anyone tell me what the possible outcomes are? So let's take a look. If Ned applies annihilating fire's effect first, then Pulmonix liver is exiled, and then Pulmonix liver's effect no longer applies because it's not dying. If he applies Pulmonix liver's effect first, he can choose to put it on top of his library, and again, there's nothing left for annihilating fire's effect to apply to because it's no longer dying. Our next example, going back to phytohydra, I guess. Going back to phytohydra, is phytohydra's effect a self-replacement effect? How many people say yes? How many people say no? It's not a self-replacement effect because it does not replace its own effect. It's not part of a resolving spell or ability. It just looks for an external event of phytohydra is dealt damage and replaces that with putting counters on phytohydra.
The ability, really no damage is done.
Sorry?
With phytohydra, no damage is done. It's replaced.
After the effect is applied, there's no longer any damage being dealt.
And all instant relative to damage, it's not applied.
Right. If there's damage being dealt to phytohydra and you apply its effect, it changes some damage being dealt to phytohydra with some counters put on phytohydra. There's no longer any damage being dealt. Anything else that looks for damage being dealt to phytohydra will not see any damage being dealt. In our next example, Alice controls Crumbling Sanctuary, which replaces damage with exiling cards from her library. Ned controls Divine Presence, also has a replacement effect. Again, uses the word instead, so you can recognize it as a replacement effect. And here we go, Ned casts Inferno again. So what happens to Alice, and who decides? Okay, but now you should know who decides. How many people say that Alice decides? How many people say that Ned decides? Again, Alice being the one dealt damage, she's the affected player. So Alice decides here. She chooses the order in which to apply the replacement effects. Again, we have two effects. They can both be applied to the damage being dealt by Inferno, either Crumbling Sanctuary or Divine Presence. If she applies Crumbling Sanctuary's effect first, she exiles 6 cards from her library. Now this effect changed damage, replaced it with exiled cards from the library, so there's no longer any event for Divine Presence to replace. On the other hand, if she applies Divine Presence first, it changes Inferno deals 6 damage to Inferno deals 3 damage. Now there's still a damage deal in an event, so Crumbling Sanctuary's effect still applies, and she'll exile 3 cards from the top of her library. So either way, she's exiling some cards from the top of her library. The only question is how many. Our next example, Ned controls Pyromancer's Swath. Again, it's a replacement effect because it modifies damage and it uses the word instead. I'll give you a moment to read it. Ned controls Divine Presence. And I think you know what's coming up next. Inferno. Here we go. What happens to Alice? So, obviously Alice decides. So again, we have 2 replacement effects that can apply. Pyromancer's Swath will add 2 to the damage, and Divine Presence will cut the damage down to 3. If she applies Pyromancer's Swath's effect first, it changes Inferno deals 6 damage into Inferno deals 8 damage. Now Divine Presence's effect applies and changes that to Inferno deals 3 damage. On the other hand, if she applies Divine Presence's effect first, it changes Inferno deals 6 to Inferno deals 3. Pyromancer's Swath's effect still applies, so it changes Inferno deals 3 into Inferno deals 5. Well, let's take a look at this. If she applies Divine Presence first, the total outcome is that Inferno deals 5 damage. But Divine Presence says that it changes damage of more than 3 into 3. So how is it possible for a source to deal more than 3 damage as long as Divine Presence is on the table? Why doesn't Divine Presence just change all that damage, change the 5 damage back to 3 damage?
Certain events can be replaced by a single effect of device.
Exactly. Each replacement effect can be applied only once to a particular event. Once you've applied it, you don't go back and apply it again. So in this case, Divine Presence was already applied to the event. So once it's been applied, just not look back and apply again. That's how Inferno gets to deal 5 damage in this case.
So if instead of Inferno I have a lightning bolt, then there is only one way for those replacement effects to work, right?
If there's a lightning bolt, which normally deals 3 damage, then Divine Presence's effect does not apply. Therefore, Ned must apply Pyromancer's Swath's effect first, changing the 3 to 5. Now Divine Presence becomes applicable and changes the 5 back to 3. Here is Alice with a Serra Angel, enchanted by Mammoth Umbra. You can see Mammoth Umbra's totem armor has a replacement effect. It's in the reminder text there. And Ned casts Debt of Loyalty. Debt of Loyalty is a regeneration effect, therefore it's also a replacement effect. So I think you all know what's coming up next. This time it's murder. So when murder resolves, what happens to Serra Angel and who chooses? So first, who chooses? How many people say Alice chooses? And how many people say that Ned chooses? Can anyone tell me what the possible outcomes are here? Let's take a look. First, Alice controls Serra Angel, so she chooses the order of the replacement effects. There's 2 possible replacement effects that replace Serra Angel dying. If she applies Debt of Loyalty's effect first, then Serra Angel is regenerated and Ned gains control of it. Now Serra Angel's no longer dying, so Mammoth Umbra's effect no longer applies. On the other hand, if she applies Mammoth Umbra's effect first, she destroys Mammoth Umbra instead of destroying Serra Angel. Now Serra Angel is no longer being destroyed, so Debt of Loyalty's effect no longer applies. Yep.
But if you cast a spell to destroy again the Serra Angel, we apply the Death of Loyalty.
So in each of these cases, if Serra Angel is destroyed again, there's still a possible replacement effect to apply. Because in the first case, Mammoth Umbra's effect was not applied, so it's still there to apply to the next destruction event. In the second case, Debt of Loyalty set up a regeneration shield, so for the rest of the turn, if there's another destruction event, then Debt of Loyalty will regenerate Serra Angel. In the next example, Alice controls Rock's Faith Mender, which we've seen before, in Levels for Life Field. And in her upkeep, she activates Words of Worship. I'll give you a moment to read Words of Worship. So what happens in Alice's draw step? Can anyone tell me? Let's take a look. So at the beginning of Alice's draw step, she's about to draw a card. Only one replacement effect applies at this point. Words of Worship is going to replace Alice draws with Alice gains 5 life. There's no other replacement effect that applies here because the event is Alice draws a card. However, once that effect has been applied, now the event is Alice gains 5 life. And even though Rock's Faith Mender's replacement effects did not apply to the original event, it newly applies to the new event, which is Alice gains 5 life, so it must be applied to the new event. Therefore, Alice gains 10 life. Now we have Alice controlling Doubling Season. Again, we saw Doubling Season earlier. She's at 4 life. She casts Gather the Townfolk. She puts 5 human tokens onto the battlefield. Is this a legal outcome? How many people say yes? And how many people say no? If you need a moment to read the cards before you make a decision. So how many people say, yes, this is legal? And how many people say, no, this is not legal? Let's take a look at what happens. So gather the townsfolk has a self-replacement effect. It modifies what happens as gather the townsfolk resolves. It doesn't apply to any other events, only to gather the townsfolk itself. Because it's a self-replacement effect, it must be applied first. So it changes Alice puts 2 tokens onto the battlefield into Alice puts 5 tokens onto the battlefield. Then, Dublin Season's effect is applied. It changes 5 tokens into 10 tokens. So Alice therefore gets 10 human tokens. She cannot get only 5. There's no way to apply Dublin Season first and then gather the townsfolk. Now Alice controls Leyland of the Void. Again, a self-replacement effect. You can see the word instead. I'll give you a moment to read it. This is not a self-replacement effect because it does not modify or resolve the spell or ability. She casts Spectre's Wail, targeting Ned, so Ned's going to discard a card. Clever Ned, he discards Loxodon Smiter. I'll give you a moment to read Loxodon Smiter. Also has a replacement effect, uses the word instead. What zone does Loxodon Smiter end up in, and who chooses? So, first, how many people say that Alice chooses? How many people say that Ned chooses? So, there's no controller of Loxodon Smiter, because it's not a spell or a permanent. But Ned is the owner, therefore he chooses the order of the replacement effects. If he applies Leyline of the Void's effect first, Loxodon Smiter is exiled. Now, Loxodon Smiter's effect no longer applies. If he applies Loxodon Smiter's effect first, then Loxodon Smiter is put onto the battlefield, and Leyline of the Void's effect no longer applies. Note that both of these replacement effects look for the event of a card being put into the graveyard. That's why when you apply one of them, it changes the effect of the card no longer being put into the graveyard, therefore the other effect no longer applies. Here's another Sarah Angel. This time Alice has enchanted it with Infinite Reflection. She is dearly departed in her graveyard. Dearly departed has a replacement effect. I'll give you a moment to read Dearly Departed. Oh, you should also read Infinite Reflection while you're at it. So, Alice casts Champion of the Parish. This is a human creature spell. And into the battlefield with +1/+1 counter. How many people say yes? Yes to the +1/+1 counter. How many people say no to the +1/+1 counter? So let's take a look at what happens. There are 2 replacement effects that could apply to Champion of the Parish entering the battlefield. Both of these look for the same event. Infinite Reflection modifies how it enters the battlefield and will change it into a Sarah Angel. Dearly Departed looks for entering the battlefield and will put a +1/+1 counter on it as it enters the battlefield. However, Infinite Reflection's effect is a copy effect. Therefore, it must be applied first. So it changes Champion of the Parish enters the battlefield to Champion of the Parish enters the battlefield as a copy of Sarah Angel. Now it's entering the battlefield as an angel, not a human. So Dearly Departed effect no longer applies. Therefore, it cannot enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. This is not a case of Alice choosing the order in which to apply her effects, because they are different categories of effects. She must apply them in this order.
In a competitive tournament, if you don't apply this replacement event in order, it's a game rule violation?
In a competitive REL tournament, if you don't apply your replacement effects correctly, it is a game rule violation. These are not triggered abilities, so it just falls into that general category of game rule violation if you don't apply them correctly. You never have the option to forget your replacement effects. And if for some reason you do forget your replacement effects, then the judge will have to go back and fix what happened. So, our next example, Alice controls Essence of the Wild. Alice Essence of the Wild changes all her creatures into 6/6 tree folk. And what's better than having one 6/6 tree folk? 4 more 6/6 tree folk. In fact, it's such a good idea that Ned thinks he'd like to have some 6/6 tree folk himself. So what happens here? Can anybody tell me the outcome? Let's take a look. So gather specimens effect must be applied first because it's a control changing effect. Then essence the wild's replacement effect can no longer be applied because gather specimens has changed the event from Alice puts 4 1/1 goblin tokens onto the battlefield into Ned puts 4 1/1 tokens onto the battlefield. Essence of the wild only applies to Alice's creatures, not to Ned's creatures. So Ned gets his 4 creatures, but they're only 1/1 goblins.
You can put the you can cast the Gatherer specimen after the copies. No. You can cast.
Can only have an effect before the creatures would enter the battlefield. So it has to be cast before Goblin Rally results.
Okay.
Now I'd like to compare 2 different cards. First one is Valak of the Melting Pinnacle. Probably many of you are already familiar with this card because it's very common in Modern. So if someone plays Valak of the Molten Pinnacle, it enters the battlefield tapped. Let's look at another card, Orb of Dreams, not quite as popular. Orb of Dreams says permanents enter the battlefield tapped. So you cast Orb of Dreams, enters the battlefield, tapped or untapped? How many people say tapped? And how many people say untapped? The answer is untapped. The reason is that some replacement effects modify how the permanent enters the battlefield. If they come from the permanent itself, they can only affect that permanent if that's the only thing that they affect. Orb of Dreams affects all permanents. It does not affect only itself. Therefore, its replacement effect does not apply to itself. Valakut, on the other hand, has a replacement effect that only modifies itself. Therefore, it does apply to Valakut. Now let's look at damage redirection effects. Here's an example. Ned controls Palisade Giant. Palisade Giant redirects damage from Ned or his other creatures back onto Palisade Giant. Alice casts Incinerate, targeting Ned. Ned, in response, casts Civi's Valor, targeting Palisade Giant. I'll give you a moment to read Civi's Valor. Civi's Valor is another damage redirection effect. So where does Incinerate's damage go, and who decides? So first question, who decides? How many people say it's Alice? How many people say it's Ned? Where does Incinerate's damage go? Anyone tell me? How many people say Ned gets to choose between Palisade Giant and himself? How many people say it's always Palisade Giant? How many people say it's always Ned? So, at the beginning of this event, only Palisade Giant's replacement effect applies. There are no other replacement effects to apply because Civi's Valor doesn't apply to damage being dealt to Ned. So Palisade Giant is going to redirect the damage from Ned onto Palisade Giant. Now that we have damage being dealt to Palisade Giant, Civi's Valor's effect newly applies. Because it newly applies and has not been applied yet, it must be applied to this event. Therefore, Incinerate deals 3 damage to Ned. There's no other possible outcome. Ned doesn't get to make a choice. The effects must be applied in this order. Suppose Alice had targeted Palisade Giant instead of Ned. What would be the outcome?
No damage to Ned.
In that case, the 2 replacement effects are applied in the opposite order, and Incinerate would deal 3 damage to Palisade Giant. Because first, Civi's Valor would redirect it to Ned, then Palisade Giant would redirect it back to itself. Our next example, Ned controls Imperial Archangel, also has a damage redirection effect. You can see it uses the word instead. Ned also controls Sphere of Law. Sphere of Law is a damage prevention effect, not redirection. It says whenever damage will be dealt from a red source to Ned, prevent 2 of that damage. Now Alice casts Incinerate, targeting Ned. How much damage does incinerate deal and where, and who decides? So, easy question first, who decides? How many people say it's Alice? How many people say it's Ned? Good, glad to see you're all picking this up. Let's look at how this breaks down. The affected player is Ned. Ned gets to choose the order in which to apply the effects. There are two replacement effects he could apply. He could apply Imperial Archangel first, because he's being dealt damage from Incinerate. Or he could apply Sphere of Law first, because again, he's being dealt damage from Incinerate, which is a red source. If he applies Sphere of Law's effect first, the Incinerate deals 1 damage to him, but that's redirected onto Imperial Archangel. If he applies Imperial Archangel's effect first, Imperial Archangel is now receiving 3 damage, but Sphere of Law's effect no longer applies, because no damage is being dealt to Ned. Therefore, Imperial Archangel takes all 3 damage. Here's my last example. Alice controls Vraska the Unseen with 5 loyalty counters. Obviously, Vraska is a Planeswalker. Alice also controls Imperial Archangel. And back to my favorite spell, Inferno. Can Ned use Inferno to kill Vraska, and who decides? So, first, who decides? How many people say it's Alice? How many people say it's Ned? How many people say Ned can use Inferno to kill Vraska? How many people say he cannot? So let's look at the applicable rule. We have the Planeswalker redirection rule. It says if non-combat damage would be dealt to a player by a source the opponent controls, that opponent may instead have a source deal damage to a Planeswalker that the player controls. This is a redirection effect, subject to the normal rules for order and replacement effects. The opponent chooses whether to redirect the damage as the effect is applied. So Ned doesn't make any decisions about redirecting damage to the Planeswalker until this redirection effect is applied. Therefore, again, we have two redirection effects possibly applicable here. So before Ned's making any decisions, Alice must decide the order in which to apply these redirection effects. If she applies the Planeswalker redirection rule first, at that point Ned decides whether to redirect Inferno's damage to Vraska. If he does, Imperial Archangel's effect no longer applies, because it only applies to damage being dealt to Alice. If he chooses not to, then Imperial Archangel's effect will still apply. However, if Alice is smart, she'll apply Imperial Archangel's effect first. Therefore, Inferno's damage is redirected to Imperial Archangel, and the Planeswalker redirection rule no longer applies. Any questions? Okay, thank you for joining me.
Ned controls Twin Sphere and Talia, the Guardian of Talia.
Talia, Guardian of Raven. What was the first card?
Twin Sphere.
The Twin Sphere.
Twin Sphere.
Alice play Brainstorm.
So, Trinisphere is not actually a replacement effect. It modifies how the costs are being paid. And when you're calculating the cost to cast a spell, Trinisphere's effect is always applied last. So if you have a spell that costs less than 3, and Thalia's effect increases the cost to 3, then Trinisphere's effect won't do anything because it's already costing 3.
So, what is a good way to answer questions about replacement effects in competitive round? Okay, tomorrow someone comes to me and says, what happens here? How do I not coach them?
It's difficult sometimes to explain replacement effects to a player because of the long competition development. There are no choices to be made. It's easy. If there are choices to be made, then you have to tell them who the effective player is, and then that way they
So, but I would never have to explain what happens to each of these, what happens to each of that. I just say, there are 2 things, you choose which one from them. Then you choose the wrong thing, oh well.
Okay, guys, thank you very much, Steven. Everybody has one for Steven's presentation.